Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for another installment of our Summer Survivor Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, and I am the Chief Education Programs and Exhibitions Officer here at the museum. And I think you will really find today's talk by a second-generation survivor speaker, Mark Jacobs, the son of Mike Jacobs, extremely enlightening. Thank you, before we begin, to our sponsor for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series, Ernst & Young LLP. Thank you also to our community partners for this series, Avance North Texas, Communities Foundation of Texas, Educational First Steps, Faith Forward Dallas, George W. Bush Presidential Center, International Rescue Committee in Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Reach of Dallas, SMU Human Rights Program, and the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Without your help, we could not bring these types of programs to you. So today we will be hearing from 2G Mark Jacobs, as I said, and he will be sharing his father, Mike Jacobs' story with you. And I turn you over now to Mark.
Hi, good afternoon. It's great to be here. My name is Mark Jacobs, and my father was Michael Jacobs, a survivor. So that makes me a second generation. I have two brothers and a sister, so we're all second generation, of course. And put my glasses on. My father's original name was Mendel Yakubovich, and I'm named for my grandfather. My name is Mark, my Hebrew name is Moshe, and my grandfather's Hebrew name was also Moshe. And my middle name is Edward, and I was named after a brother who predeceased my father's birth in an accident. All my siblings are named after siblings of my father. So my sister is Deborah Ray, and Deborah is named after my grandmother, my father's father, and named after my maternal grandmother. And my two brothers, Andrew Saul and Reuben Solomon, are all named after brothers of my father. My father was one of the founders of the Holocaust Museum. Originally it was called the Dallas Holocaust Museum. And that's why we're here. And that's how we came to this point in this beautiful facility, which just opened in September of 2019. The original facility was in the bottom of the ground floor of the Jewish Community Center in Dallas, and it opened on April 15th, 1984. And in this slide, you see my father with Elie Wiesel, and they were looking at plans for the museum, and several other survivors, one of whom, Max Glauben, is still speaking as well, and he's just recently turned 92 or 93, and he speaks, and he's really the face of the Holocaust survivor group now. On the right-hand side is the original memorial center, the memorial room, and you have the gates, and then you have the memorial room, and the stones representing the Holocaust. I'm sorry. On the right are the memorial gates and the memorial room, which has been recreated in this facility. As I said, this opened April 15th, 1984, and at that time it was a labor of love of my father and the survivors at that time. It was the first freestanding, independent Holocaust museum in the country. Most museums at that time were affiliated with universities. And here we are today, a wonderful facility. So my father is going to speak next.
And I always said to myself in camp that one day I'm going to be free. And the time will come. I will try to build a center, not a memorial stone, but a center that people can come, learn from the past, to look into the future. That should never happen again. That children, young or old, can come to the center and touch it and feel it and walk out and see what one human could do to the other. My speaking to you over here or sharing my experience, it's not for me. I went through. It's for the future generations, that they can listen and look at it, look at a living survivor, because I'm not going to be over here all the time. Someday I will have to go. They can say, yes, that's a survivor. He's telling the story. What one human could do to the other should never let it happen again. That's my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren should not go through the horrors and should be left to see what the parents or the grandparents should go through. As they should not go out from this Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies in Dallas.
I'd also like to mention, I already mentioned Max Glaubman, I'd like to mention Maggie First, who's also a survivor and speaks, and Bert Romberg, their brother and sister. And they both speak, and I hope that all of you have had a chance to hear them as well, because they also have a very unique story. My father passed away 6 years ago, but prior to his passing, he used to speak all over the North Texas area, and some of you may have heard him in your churches or your synagogues or your temples or at schools or at civic groups. Anyway, his story begins in Konin, Poland. He was born December 29th, 1924. Poland is a small town of about 10,000 people located halfway between Berlin, Germany, and Warsaw, Poland. About 30% of the town was Jewish, and everybody got along fine back in those days. He had a fairly normal childhood. He had parents, they worked. His mother baked matzahs for Passover. She ran a little general store. His father used to do cartage. He would take a cart and go between the towns transporting goods. He had uncles and aunts and cousins all over the place near that area. He went to a public school. He didn't go to a Jewish school. He had to go to the public school there. And these are pictures of the family, of his siblings. Unfortunately, he never had a picture of his parents. And he always wanted to find, oops, there we go. This is his family. Sorry. This is his family, and pictures of his brothers and his sisters. He never was able to find pictures of his parents, unfortunately. A number of his family emigrated to South Africa and to what was then Palestine, and later on in life he was able to pick up some of these pictures of different relatives. I'd just like to point out the picture of the 4 little girls in the corner, and it was pretty amazing when we got this picture because they looked so much like our nieces, it was uncanny. It was just really amazing. So he had all these siblings and cousins, and he had a really wonderful life. One of the things in our life, in my siblings' lives, that we always bemoaned or really missed was having first cousins. My mother had a sister who passed away before she had any children, so it was just the 4 of us. And my father used to always talk about getting together with his cousins and playing, and on Friday night they would have Shabbat dinner, which is our Sabbath, and everybody would get together, and his grandparents, and we used to love hearing those stories. So now he's going to talk about his life.
Our city, as I mentioned before, they were all hard-working families. My family was working pretty hard to make a living, My father, had to work very hard to support, 6 children, till in 1935, if I'm correct, my brother became a master tailor. Let me explain to you what a master tailor is. He had to go to a special school to get a diploma that he can keep, apprentices and to teach them to be tailors. At this time, we already did a little better living in our city. I remember, that it was times, that we at night you didn't have any more bread, because it's not like over here you came into a home, you had enough bread, you cut as much as you want. Over there you had your slice or 2 slices of bread in the morning and lunch, and you came home for supper, the same thing, and you had to wait for next day to have your other meal, because it was a very hard living, but we always had enough meat on the table Friday night we had a nice Shabbos, in the afternoon we had our cholent, and other things, We were a very, very close family. Very, very close family.
On September 1st, his life changed forever. That's when the Nazis and the German army invaded from Germany from the west, and the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. A couple of weeks after the invasion took place, they came to his synagogue because it was around the high holiday time, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is coming up in September. And they were at the synagogue, and the Germans came to his town. And he's going to talk about what that was like.
1939, when the Nazis marched into our city, the first thing they did, they put a curfew. The Jewish people were not allowed to walk out from their homes from 6 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning, and the non-Jewish people from 9 o'clock till 6 o'clock in the morning. They took hostages, Jewish people and non-Jewish people. They put them to jail. They took also out the intelligentsia, the teachers. They brought them up to the Jewish cemetery, and they were shot. 99% non-Jewish teachers went into our beautiful ancient synagogue. They took out all the prayer books, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the prayer shawls, and all the religious memorabilia, and they put it into the square. After they emptied everything from the synagogue, they made a horse stable.
Not long after Conan was occupied by the Germans, they gathered everybody in the community, took him by train to another town you can see on the map called Auschwitz. And what awaited them there was a ghetto. My father and his family and all the other people in the community were packed into cattle cars, 75 to 100 in each car, no room to move, no food, nothing to drink, no facilities. They didn't stop to let people out. They were just packed into this car, and eventually they wound up in Auschwitz, where they were allowed to leave the boxcars, and they were put into a ghetto. They were assigned quarters, and that was what their life was like for the foreseeable future. And my dad is going to talk about that experience.
We came into Auschwitz. I remember Jewish people were waiting over there from the city. We went into a big school. And from over there, they tried to put us in different homes, And I remember they put us in a home, 2 little small rooms, 16 people, 3 families. Our family consists of 8, and my future brother-in-law, and some other 2 families. A aunt of mine with the 2 daughters, and my future sister-in-law with the family over there, because we were staying together. And the rest of my family, my relatives, were staying in different homes. And that was the ghetto. People died of hunger, of sickness. I remember, as a small boy, I still did not believe what's going to happen.
My father was in the ghetto with his family, like I said. And eventually, the Germans started rounding people up and sending them to Treblinka. And of course, everybody knows that Treblinka was a death camp. Just about everybody who went there was immediately murdered by the Nazis. There are only a handful of people who survived Treblinka. You can see from the slide here the time that it was open, the time that it closed, and how many people were murdered during that time. My father was very fortunate because he was able not to be put on a boxcar and taken to Treblinka. He and another brother were able to slip aside and avoid the fate of the rest of their family. this particular brother later on joined the underground and was later on killed by fellow Polish underground members. My father's going to talk now.
And when we went to the big square, I took a look to my left, and I said, they're selecting people over there. At this time, I saw to my older brother, next to me, I said, come on with me, I'm not going to go to the square. He said, come on. I grabbed him by the hand, and I said goodbye to my parents and relatives, you know, the dark faces, the sad faces, could never see, screaming and yelling people, you know, pushing and everything, not knowing what's going on. And I came to this selection that tried to push me in with my brother back over there. They didn't want it to go over there. I sneaked through. As I sneaked through, they put us in a small little street, you know, in a small little place. We were waiting. And later we marched in. And don't know where my parents went. They went to the same thing. They went into the boxcars, and they traveled. And later on, I found out they went to Treblinka. As you know, Treblinka was a camp of no return. But that's what I was told. Between 700,000 or 800,000 people died over there. They went right away to the gas chambers and the crematoriums. There was a camp of that's where they went. That's where the most people went. From Auschwitz, around the vicinity.
You mean your mother and father went to Treblinka?
Yeah, all of my relatives, my brothers and sisters. Yes, except one brother was died in the partisans.
Except for you and your brother that separated yourself out from the family.
That's correct.
When you separated yourself out from the family, did you say anything to your own family about why you were separating yourself out?
Nothing. You see, you have to make quick decision. They do not know. They say goodbye. I waved goodbye to them. And I moved away, right, quick, not saying where I'm going or not.
What made you think that that was the thing to do?
I don't know, some intuition or something, a drive not to go. Because I was afraid if I'm going to go to the square, I didn't want to go away anymore, be transported or do something. I don't know what the other group was selected to. Took a chance.
So he stayed in the ghetto, and he helped the Germans go through the apartments and take the belongings of the Jews. And those belongings, I think, were eventually shipped to Germany. And not long after that, he was sent to Auschwitz Birkenau. And of course, most of you know that that was one of the main death camps located in Poland. Auschwitz was where everybody first came to, and Birkenau, after you survived the selection, would go to Birkenau and have another selection. And my dad was, of course, fortunate because he was young, and he was only 15, 16 at the time. He was slender, he was strong, he had a good sense of what was going on around him, and for some odd reason, like he said, he had a good survival instinct. So he was selected for labor. And I'd like to just add here that Auschwitz was almost 15 and a half square miles. And that is 11 times the size of downtown Dallas. And I understand that some of you are not in Dallas viewing this, but downtown Dallas is actually right here. And you can get a sense of how big Auschwitz Birkenau was. It's pretty amazing. I'd like to interject. I was able to visit 3 times with my father, and it's an amazing, amazing complex. So now my father's going to talk about coming to Auschwitz.
To Birkenau, the dark cars opened, went down on the ramp, and we were waiting. As we were waiting, the orchestra was playing.
This was 1944.
44. The orchestra was playing. And I said to my friends, my God, take a look. We came into a paradise, clean, the orchestra is playing, welcoming us, everybody smiling and laughing. From the other side, on the other side of the ramp was the women's camp, FL, the Frauenlager, what they used to call. Half a dozen women came out and they were waving on us, smiling. I asked the prisoners over there, hey, what's going on? Where are we? The answer was a smile. Sure, they were not allowed. We were waiting. I looked to my right, and I saw smoke coming out from the chimneys. And I said to my friends, when they ask me what profession I am, I say, I'm a baker. If I'm a baker, and they select me, I work in a bakery, I will never go around hungry. Okay.
So when he came to Auschwitz Birkenau, as many of you know, they were tattooed. And this was these were basically the only camps, or the main camp where they issued tattoos. So my father had a tattoo put on his arm, B4990. And of course, we grew up with that, and we didn't really think that much about it. It was just part of my father. But of course, when he was speaking, he would show it to many, many people, and everybody was fascinated by the tattoo. This was the beginning of the dehumanization process that took place in the camps. The Germans wanted everybody to be known by their number. The whole point, of course, was if you could dehumanize the people there, then it was a lot easier to work them to death. So now my father is going to talk about receiving the tattoo.
We walked in to another camp, not knowing what the camp is all about, what we call the quarantine camp. As we walked into the quarantine camp, you were waiting, you had to stretch out your arm. As you stretched out your arm, they gave you a number, a tattoo number. They give you the tattoo number. And as they gave me my tattoo number, B4990, the assessment came to me, and they says to me, do you know what this number all about? I said, no, sir. Okay, let me tell you now. You are being dehumanized. You a number. Still don't know what he was talking about. Okay, still don't know.
Life in the camps was horrible. They had roll call in the morning, roll call in the evening. My father worked in a labor detail. No food, just a little bit of gruel in the morning, maybe a little bit of gruel in the evening. Cold in the winter, hot in the summer. A number of years ago, my father was on a trip to Poland, and it was like December, maybe January, and of course it was freezing, freezing cold. And one of his comments when he came back was that he doesn't know how they survived the cold because it was just bitter, 0 degrees. He worked in a scrapyard, which of course is rather ironic because eventually he began a scrapyard in Dallas, Texas, and worked in the business until he passed away. And of course, Birkenau was a death camp, so he witnessed people who were going off to the gas chambers and eventually to the crematorium. There was an underground uprising which he participated in, and now he's going to talk about how he survived.
How did I survive? I was a dreamer, a fantasizer. I tried to make myself human. Of course, they said I'm not. I saw birds flying into camp. I can see it right now, but I'm talking to you. I'm in Birkenau, laying on the bunk. I could see birds flying in and picking on the ground. And I said to myself, what they can pick on the ground if we cannot see it? And they flew out. And I said, why can't I be a bird? And I said to myself, Mike, close your eyes and start to fantasize. I closed my eyes and I was a bird, and I flew out and I was free. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the same surrounding, but for the few moments when I was dreaming and fantasizing, I was a free person. I was free. I was somebody again. Did you ever see boxcars or railroad cars traveling on the rail? So nice and peacefully in different directions, nobody's telling them where you're going, they're pulled. Nobody's asking for an identification card, no nothing. And I said to myself, isn't it nice and quiet? Why can't I be a boxcar? I changed myself for a plank of wood to be part of the boxcar, and I was traveling again. I was free again. The most precious thing a person can have or can possess is to be free. Make no difference what you have, how rich and how the luxuries you have. When you're not free, you are nothing. Dreaming and fantasizing, make myself always reminding myself that I'm a person like anybody else, kept me going. And I always say I never lost my hope, never lost my belief.
And that was what he always talked about, how he never lost hope and never lost his belief. He was always very optimistic about everything. And that's one thing that he imparted to us, his family, and everybody that he would speak to. In January 1945, just 75 years ago, the Soviet Union forces, the Red Army, was coming in from the east, and the Germans started to panic, of course, and they gathered up all the able-bodied people and put them into and started a death march towards the west, out of Poland into Austria into Germany. My father was still relatively healthy, and he was on this death march. The only people who were left behind were the sick and infirm, so when the Red Army came in, they liberated those people who were left behind. And now he's going to talk about the death march.
January the 18th, 1945, the Russian army are closing in. They stopped 40 kilometers, 27 miles from Auschwitz. They could walk in with one tank and liberate us. They gathered us in Auschwitz, 1 o'clock in the morning of the 19th. They took us out, and we marching in snow, cold, 35 kilometers a day, no food, no water. I had plenty of water, snow. We marching, not know where we're going. People what could not make it, I can see it now, the people they're staring at me. Because they fall back, they lost their wooden shoes in the deep snow, or they couldn't make it, they fall back. They were shot, not with a regular bullet, but with a dum-dum bullet, with a shadow bullet. If the person gets shot in their head, the head will split in dozens of pieces. The side of the roads, you can see it now, was not white. Everything was red.
Eventually, my father wound up at a camp called Mauthausen, which was the main camp. This camp was in Austria, and he went through another selection, and he was transported over to Gusen II, which was one of the subcamps. Mauthausen wasn't a death camp, but a lot of people died there because they were worked to death. In Gusen, he was assigned to a labor detail where they put him into a mountain that had been hollowed out, and they were building Messerschmitt airplanes. And one of the things that he was involved in was sabotaging these Messerschmitt airplanes. And he's going to talk about that now.
That took me down to Gusen. It was a small camp of 7,500 people. Every day used to bring in a transport of 1,000 or 1,500 people. Every day was the same amount of people. People died, new people came in. And they put me in to work in a factory building Messerschmitt planes. You know, the big Jaeger planes. And the factories were built already in the big mountains. Every day we used to get packed in the railroad cars, and we used to travel. It was too far to travel. They brought us back. I built a part in the plane, what we call the shot fender. It was a small little round piece. You know, you had to weld it, you know, electric welding, and I had to make nice 3 holes. Exactly had to be the 3 holes, because every time it was checked out to the 10th of a millimeter. Into the 3 holes, the 3 wires went back, but the pilot used to control the flaps in the back, slow it down and everything. But being in the underground, I say they're not going to get away with nothing. I was pretty fast to mix up things. The plane went up, the plane came down. They didn't know what happened. They thought there's something wrong with the aluminum. They used to come and try to test the aluminum. That's what I used to do to the last minute, till May the 5th, 1945. My friends, when I go to Israel, or they're in Europe, or someplace in the United States, where we in camp, they don't call me Mike. They call me partisan. They call me partisan. Everybody will call me partisaner. See, they're calling me by first name because they know, my friends, love and I know, that's what I was doing.
Finally, May 5th, 1945, the Americans came to liberate the camps and to march across Austria into Germany to liberate Germany. And they came to Mauthausen-Gusen, and on May 5th they liberated, 75 years ago again, they liberated the camp that my father was in. As you might imagine, it was a wonderful moment for my father, waiting years for this to happen, a wonderful moment for all survivors. And I'd like to interject, I hope that you're not distracted by the fact that I keep looking at my father and listening to his voice. He passed away 6 years ago and miss him quite a bit. So it's really nice to hear his voice and see him up there. He's going to talk about liberation.
I say, okay, I go out, and I waved to the tank. A guy comes out from the turret, and I'm scared, comes out from the turret. And he threw in a small little bar. I picked up was a bar of chocolate. I grabbed it, I went into the barrack, and I said, take a look, can you imagine? They named this little chocolate Herschel. I couldn't spell the name Hershey. I said Herschel, okay? It was delicious. It was delicious. And I looked out again to the window, and now we have a guy, a civilian with a red cross band, with a soldier with a machine gun, and he waves, and everybody's scared to go to the fence. I say, okay, I'm going to go. I went to the fence, the guy tells me in German, that's, you are free now, the Americans are over here, and stay in this camp, wait over here, we're going to take you back to the main camp of Mauthausen, we're going to give you food and clothing. They told me I'm free. I was waiting for 5.5 years to hear this beautiful song, the beautiful melody that I'm free. I'm walking out from this camp. No camps for me anymore. Finally decided, next day we walked out from this camp. As I walked out on the other side of the barbed wire, I stopped and I looked. Nobody's waiting for me. Nobody's welcoming me. Where do I go? I have no home to go home. And at this time I said to myself, Mike, don't you ever look back. Think positive and keep going. I kept going, went into Linz. And that's when I was liberated by the Americans, May the 5th, 1945.
So he stayed in Linz shortly, for a little while, and then he went into Germany, to Mittenwald, which is in southern Germany, and he lived there for 6 years. He had colleagues there, friends there. He made friends. He attended a sports institute. He played soccer. He did gymnastics. He ran track and field. He worked in stores. I think that actually it wasn't such a bad life for him in Germany after the war. And of course, he was looking for relatives. He found relatives and reconnected with relatives in South Africa. He had a relative, a first cousin, who emigrated to Canada. And eventually, he came to Texas. And he's going to talk about coming to Texas. And by the way, he came to Texas in 1951, and he met my mother, and he naturalized, and that's when he officially changed his name to Michael Jacobs. Beforehand, he was Mendel Jakubowicz. And here we go.
At this time, I said to myself, I will never stop talking, if people want to listen to me or not. I have two people. If they listen for 5 minutes to walk away, I accomplish 5 minutes. And I never stopped, because it's very close to me. Again, that people should know about it. This generation and generations to come, it should never happen again. I don't want the people here in the United States, what they say was no Holocaust. Hundreds of books are written about was no Holocaust. The Holocaust is a hoax. Auschwitz is a myth. It was never Auschwitz. Those people, what they come out and tell this story or write about the Holocaust was no Holocaust, was a hoax. These are the most dangerous people walking in this United States, because those people want you and the future generation to believe that was not happening, that was not true. And again, that people be caught off guard. God forbid if those people get the power, they will do exactly the same thing, maybe worse. We must know, we must remember, we must not forget. We must always say in our mind, it can happen again. We must not be indifferent.
And that's what he always taught when he was speaking. So as I said, he came to Dallas. He married my mother, Ginger Chestnut Jacobs. They met at the Jewish Community Center when my dad was teaching calisthenics. They got married in 1953. He started his own business, Scrap Iron and Metal. I was born in 1956, and this is the legacy of my father. 4 children. My sister has 6 grandchildren, 1 on the way. My father not only was in the scrap business, but he was a soccer referee. And this is a picture of him when he was refereeing in the North American Soccer League back when we had the Dallas Tornado. He loved soccer. He loved refereeing. He was also involved in other Jewish organizations, but his passion was speaking about the Holocaust. And he, like I said, he was instrumental in starting the Holocaust Survivors Group and then going on to found the Dallas Holocaust Museum. Other survivors were very instrumental in doing this. Don't forget, this was in the 80s, and a long time ago. And back then, there were still a lot of people who really didn't think about the Holocaust that much. But he was very intent on teaching it, teaching his lessons like you just heard. And I think one of the interesting things about him talking just now was these interviews were done 20, 30 years ago. And here we are in 2020, and in the last couple of years, there's been an increase in anti-Semitism in the United States, around the world. So even now, we still have to be vigilant, very vigilant. So my father was right. And life is good, but you have to be vigilant. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me and hearing what my father had to say. I believe there are going to be some questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing your father Mike's story. So we have some questions. The first one is Carol Potter, and she would like to know if your father had nightmares or post-traumatic stress or any kind of residual effects that you were aware of from his experiences during the Holocaust.
You know, it's really pretty amazing because we never noticed that he did. Mother never really complained that he had nightmares. He never talked about hating the Germans. He never badmouthed anybody, really. It was kind of ironic that, of course, the German shepherds were the dogs of choice by the Nazis and by the Germans and terrorizing people, and we always grew up with German shepherds. From even before I was born, my parents had a German shepherd. I still have 2 German shepherds. So he never preached any sort of hate, and he never seemed to be outwardly affected by what happened to him to the point that it paralyzed him. He always had an optimistic viewpoint, and he wanted to live life. He wasn't going to let the Nazis win by making his life miserable. So we were very, very blessed about that. We were always aware about what he went through. We were always aware of his family perishing. We were always aware, of course, of the fact that he lost everything. He lost those years of his life. But we were also aware that he was committed to making the best of his life. And I think that's one of the lessons that he really taught us and tried to teach others.
Mark, this is from Jeanette Sexton. She would like to know if your mother Ginger's family had any experience in the Holocaust.
Both her parents came from Latvia, and they also happened to be first cousins, but they came here in the 1920s. We, of course, on her side, we think that there must have been relatives who were involved in the Holocaust, but there are also relatives, because they were in the Soviet Union, who supported the cause on that side. So we do know that there were 3 sisters of my grandfather who survived, and who lived on into the 60s and 70s, and they were nurses. But I don't know of any direct relatives who passed away during the Holocaust on her side. My grandfather came to the U.S. with his brother, who wound up settling in Victoria. My grandfather settled in Dallas, so that's how my mother's side came here. But she was, of course, very, very aware of what was going on because she grew up in an atmosphere that was very aware of life in Europe and in the Jewish community.
Mark, Charlotte Kimmel would like to know how old your father was when he was liberated.
He was liberated in 1945, so he would have been 26 years old. I'm sorry. He was liberated in 45, so he would have been, I have to do the math. Sorry. He was 16 years old. No, I'm sorry. He was liberated in 45. I'm kind of tongue-tied. I'm sorry. He was born in 1924 to 1945. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
Little brain fart there.
I was saying, math is not your strong suit. Join the club.
21. There 21. You go.
Okay, thank you, Annie.
Actually, he was 20 because his birthday was in December. So he would have been 20 years old. So he spent all his teenage years basically under German and Nazi occupation. Okay. And that's one of the things that we noticed when we were growing up. I was very fortunate. I had a private school education. I went to religious school. I was active in Jewish youth groups, and all of these things. Dad had. I went to college, of course, and all these things he missed in his own upbringing. So he was very, very proud of us that we were able to enjoy our teenage years.
Okay. Next question from Kristen Malmberg. She would like to know, when did you first learn about your dad's story, and did he share it with you and your siblings when you were younger, or was this something that he waited until you were older to share?
We were always aware of it. He never hid the fact that he was a survivor, so I even remember being 7, 8 years old hearing stories. And some of the survivors who lived locally in Dallas would come over in the evenings on occasion, and they would play pinochle. And they all had, of course, foreign accents. Of course, to our ears, it wasn't a foreign accent. It was my dad's accent. He sounded perfectly normal to us, as did the others. It wasn't until many years later on that we realized how heavy his accent was. But they would sit around, and they would talk about their experiences and about their life, and Dad would talk about his experience whenever we wanted to hear anything. So we grew up with all the stories. I think that, of course, it was all piecemeal, and it wasn't until later on when he wrote a memoir that was published about 20 years ago that we had everything, that we had the whole narrative all in one place. But he was definitely out there with his experiences.
Catherine Gordon would like to know if your father kept in touch with other survivors, and if so, how did he do that?
Yes, he did. There was a group of Conan survivors, and they had their own little social organization, and they would be in touch with each other. I don't think any of them are alive any longer. And then there were people after the war in Mittenwald who we stayed in touch with, some of whom I became very close friends with as well. They settled in all over the United States, but he was in touch with them, and we would go to the family weddings and bar mitzvahs. My parents made it a point to go to any happy occasion that they could go to, and occasionally I would be invited as well. He had first cousins who survived, one of whom, as I mentioned before, settled in Canada, and he and his wife used to come to Dallas all the time. There were cousins in South Africa and Israel who we stayed in touch with, and they did that by letter. Of course, we didn't have internet back then, and they also visited, so we were very privileged. I was very privileged to go to South Africa. My father went to South Africa to visit relatives. We went to Israel and saw relatives. Some of them came to visit here. So he was able to stay in touch with his friends from home. His best friend survived and lived in New York, or lived in New Jersey, and also people who he lived with after the war. And of course, they had a very, very special bond. They really understood each other.
Celeste Montelongo would like to know why your father decided to change his name when he was naturalized.
He actually always went by Mike Jacobs once he got here. The story goes that when he came off the boat into New Orleans and he took a train to Dallas, but when he was being, I guess, processed, however they did it, whoever was talking to him said, Mendel Jakubowicz is kind of a tough name. You really should shorten it. So Mendel became Mike, and Jakubowicz became Jacobs. And so he always went by Michael Jacobs, and I didn't really understand that he had not legally changed his name until he got naturalized in 1957. And I think it's kind of interesting that, of course, on my birth certificate, because I was born in 1956, it says Mike Jacobs. So he was always using Mike Jacobs once he came to the States. And I think he changed it just to make it easier. Later on in life, he said that he wished he hadn't changed it. To tell the truth, I'm kind of glad he did.
Okay. Carol Potter would like to know, what was Mike like as a father? Was he warm? Was he strict? Was he easygoing? Give us the insider scoop.
He was actually a good guy. He didn't burden us with the Holocaust memories. He did talk about his family and how much he loved them and how much he missed them. It was very important to him that we be close. So Friday nights, we ate dinner together every Friday night. We celebrated all the Jewish holidays. Back then in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't like fathers would go to all your sporting events and things like that. So he didn't do any of that. He was my Little League baseball coach for a couple of years. He basically made sure that we were well taken care of, and we went on family trips sometimes. He was not terribly affectionate, but we never doubted for a minute that he loved us fiercely and he would do anything for us. He made sure that we all got educated and that we had a nice life, and we did. We did.
Here's another question. What was your father like religiously before the Holocaust, and what was he like in terms of practice after the Holocaust, and did anything change, and why?
That's a good question. Back in Poland, you had basically everybody was Orthodox. So he went to shul every day. He went to He was educated in a Jewish background. They kept kosher. Everybody kept kosher. He attended synagogue on all the holidays. Everything was very strictly observed. And when he came to Dallas, he continued that. My mother grew up in Congregation Shereth Israel, so we grew up in Congregation Shereth Israel, which is a conservative synagogue. We did not keep kosher growing up, but we kept kosher style. We all went to religious school. My two brothers went to Jewish day school. We were all bar and bat mitzvahed. We all had really good Jewish backgrounds. We observed all the holidays. I stayed out of school on all the major Jewish holidays. And as he became older and was retired, he and my mother went to synagogue every Shabbat, Saturday morning for 30 years. They would go to shul. So I would say that his observance from when he grew up continued on until he passed away. He was in synagogue probably 2 weeks before he died.
This audience member would like to know, how do you think his optimism helped him survive the war?
Like he said, he never gave up hope. He never gave up the dream that he would survive and come out of camp alive. And I think that the optimism and the sense that he had to have hope is one of the things that he kept alive and kept him alive. And one of the things that he always told us, that he wasn't going to let the Germans kill him. And he didn't. They didn't kill him physically. They didn't kill him spiritually. They didn't kill him emotionally. He was a pretty tough guy. And he kept that inside him. And I think that part of it was that he was able to compartmentalize what was happening to him. And on the other hand, he was also able to, like you said, he was able to dream of being liberated and of being a bird and flying out of the camps. So he always maintained the optimism.
Okay, I think two more questions and we'll... So the first question is, what was it like growing up without any relatives around on your father's side? Were you aware that this was odd, or was this just something that was normal for you?
Both. I think we really, fortunately, my mother's father lived with us for a number of years until he passed away in 1968. So at least we had him, and he was a wonderful, kind grandfather, Grampsy. But we were well aware that that we didn't have any close relatives on my father's side, and we had neighbors who had all 4 grandparents, and they took them for granted. And they had uncles and aunts, and they took them for granted. And I just remember being horrified at how could you be that way? You know, how could you not cherish your relatives? So we were always very aware of what we didn't have. And I would say for my sister and her grandchildren, they're all fairly close in age, and they're all first cousins. They all know each other. They FaceTime. They see each other. So they have what we didn't have, and it's really wonderful to see. And I think that that was also true of some of our friends whose parents were survivors. They didn't have the close relatives either, but we all kind of banded together, and we were friends and loved each other and loved whoever we could love.
A final question from Celeste Montelongo, and I think it's a very important question. Did your father continue to enjoy a lot of chocolate?
Yes. He did continue to enjoy lots of chocolate. As a matter of fact, later on he became very friendly with the members of the battalion who liberated Mauthausen, who liberated him, and one of whom, Harry Schaefer, on the date of liberation, would always send a packet of Hershey's Kisses to my father, and that went on for several decades until Harry and his wife passed on. So yes, he continued to love chocolate, and he would always get a glint in his eye when he would talk about the Herschel bar. That was very, very special to him, and I'm happy to say that I carry on with my love of chocolate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your father, Mike Mendel Jakubowicz Jacobs' story with us today. Thank you all for having joined us here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Please join us again later this month and also next month for more of these testimonies in this series. And in the meantime, we wish you a safe and sweet afternoon.
Be safe, everybody.